Welcome to What Would Jesus Tech, a podcast between two friends, a Bible student, me, and techie, that's Joel Jacob, and we try to work out how Jesus would use tech if he lived today. We all know social media, but few of us realize just how many ways it is affecting our lives, from friendships to our pride, from conspiracy theories to anxieties, from our view of sex to our view of God. And I'm so glad Chris Martin has written The Wolf in Their Pockets, 13 Ways the Social Internet Threatens the People You Lead. And we're very glad to have him here today to discuss it. Thanks, Chris, for joining us on WWJT.
Sure. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, no. Just to give people some background, Chris Martin is the content marketing editor at Moody Publishers. He studies internet culture and the effects of social media. And in his own words, he does this for fun. He published a book in February 22 called Terms of Service, which is behind me. And he also has a weekly tech newsletter that I would encourage everybody to subscribe to. It's same title, Terms of Service, really helpful. And just a few more questions to help people get to know you, Chris. You also have a newsletter called The Funnies. What inspired you to get that started?
That's a really good question. I don't get a lot of questions about the Funnies, despite the fact that it's actually more popular than my more substantive newsletter, Terms of Service, which is both happy and sad all at the same time. The Funny, so how the Funnies was born was, so I run this newsletter, Terms of Service, and every Thursday is like a roundup of like things I've been reading and just kind of a curation of various things. And at some point in the process of that Thursday newsletter, I started putting something I call the funny part. I think it was pretty early on. It was a few years ago now. And it was just the, a funny tweet I found or meme or sometimes YouTube clip or whatever, just to break it up and make it not so serious. And so what I found in looking at some data on the newsletter was that the most clicked piece of content in the weekly Thursday newsletter was the funny part. And I was like, oh, that's funny and makes sense kind of. What if I just made a newsletter that was all of this stuff? Like it was just a newsletter full of funny parts. I was like, I'm looking at this stuff all day, every day and texting it to my friends anyway. I might as well make a text or make a newsletter of it and invite more people. So for like the first year, not the year, probably 6 months, it was like 20 friends and family who were on it. And then slowly but surely more people started picking it up. And now, gosh, I think we add 50 or 100 people every week, and I don't talk about it. Like I don't promote it or anything, but it's just like people I think forward it along and then they subscribe and stuff. So it's at like 3,000 people, I think, which is just crazy because it's just like something it's 100% organic, like nothing I've done really. But it's really fun and it's just a blast. I love it. And so I recommend the Funnies. If you get nothing else out of this interview, subscribe to the Funnies. It's a good time.
There you go. Have a good laugh. Last background question, your interest in bird watching. What's your favorite bird to look at?
Well, I've never seen a bald eagle in real life, and I would love to see one of those. And we reportedly have some around where I live. I live close to a river, and my understanding is from friends who live close to the river is that some will often nest in the trees above the river because they like to catch fish down there. So it's like, I would love to see a bald eagle, but I've never seen one. And it's like not too far from my house. They probably live, but I really only watch around my house. I'm like the most casual bird watcher to ever call himself a bird watcher, I think is how I've said it. I just have a lot of feeders around the house. I have some bird houses. I have a window feeder on my office window right here that I have to occasionally shoo squirrels off of. My favorite, man. I love a good woodpecker because I love that I hear them before I see them and it's like, where are they? So that's fun. And I think cardinals are like my favorite just to see though. They're just so pretty, like the really bright red ones, and blue jays. Those cardinals and blue jays are both really pretty. And the blue jays, I don't know if this is typical. I don't know enough about birds, but the blue jays around my house are bullies. And I think they might have that reputation generally.
Yeah, I think they do.
But man, they get feisty with the other birds. I'll tell you what. And their black markings around their faces are just so distinct. And so those are the ones I love to see. I get doves a lot of grackles. They're like the purple black bird kind of thing, and they like flock to my main back bird feeder, and will scoop seed onto the ground. And then like 2 or 3 will scoop seed with their beaks onto the ground. And then there'll be like 15 on the ground just eating it off. I'm like, I got to stop wasting bird seed. The grackles just scoop it onto the ground and eat it all up. But anyway, so I think I like cardinals are pretty. Blue jays are pretty. We don't get anything super exotic where I'm at. So
Fair enough. Cool. And wolves, do you have an interest in wolves? Where did the title of the book come from?
there are 2 wolves inside of you. No, the title, frankly, I wish I had a profound story for it. I was writing the proposal. Terms had not even come out yet. And I knew that I wanted to write a second book that was more specific for leaders. And that was confirmed that after Terms came out, the primary feedback I got from a lot of readers was, hey, this book Terms is really helpful, but can you write something that's more specific for leaders? And I said, actually, I'm already working on that.
Nice.
And when I was writing the proposal, I kept trying to think of like an image or a metaphor to use. I often think in images and metaphors. Sometimes it makes it into my writing, but
Yeah.
sometimes you don't want to do that too much or you can lose people. I hear mixing metaphors is bad. And so I was like, yeah, I just think of like pastors are shepherds. And what do shepherds do? They lead sheep and they're trying to protect sheep from wolves. And then the natural progression was, I don't think pastors know that their sheep are carrying wolves around in their pockets. That was kind of the thought process. And so I think I only used the image like once, the metaphor like once. And it's not like it's a woven through theme or anything. But I just kind of like, it was one of those things where I need to title this proposal something. And so I just titled the Word doc, The Wolf in Their Pockets, or some form of that. And then when we sent it to the publisher, which happens to be my employer, but my agent and I actually sent it to a bunch of different publishers. Eventually, the publisher decided, hey, we actually think this is a good title. You always want to be careful when you're titling a book because you don't want to be too cute, but sometimes being cute and clever can be helpful if you have a good subtitle. And so I didn't think the titling team here at Moody Publishers would take it because they would think it's too cute, but they ended up really liking it. And so they went with it and said, are you cool if we just keep this? And I said, yeah, sure. Let's go for it. So.
Yeah, cool. I mean, the subtitle there, 13 Ways the Social Internet Threatens the People You Lead.
It tells you what you need to know.
Yeah, and 13 is a pretty big number. I can imagine it being really difficult to write a book around so many topics, addressing it biblically, then also offering practical guidance, and then for so many different types of Christian leaders. How did you approach, the challenge of writing a book of that nature?
With a lot of help. So I had an idea of a handful of topics that would need to be addressed in a book like this. I lead in the student ministry at my church. I've been leading in student ministry since I was a senior in high school. So every church I was at in college, and since I'm 32, so every church I was at in college, and since then I've found a way to plug into the student ministry, usually just as a lay leader, but at least once as like an on staff member, like a volunteer, unpaid, but on the staff as like the main guy. And so I kind of know what this is like, as a foot soldier doing this and having conversations with parents and hanging out with teenagers. I know what a lot of the key issues are. And this is not just a youth ministry book, but obviously teenagers are power users of social media. So you see a lot of the issues there. And so I knew of a good handful of topics that should be covered, but I didn't want to only rely on my lived experience. I wanted to talk to a lot of people. So I sent a Google form out to 2 or 3 dozen people who are pastors, church leaders, parents, even I think like a couple of people who are like teachers in Christian schools. Basically, I wanted people who could be called Christian leaders, either formally or informally, who are basically in charge of discipling someone else. And I know of that. I forget what all was in the questionnaire, the little form, but it was 5 or 6 questions like, what do you, and one of them was, what, like, here's an idea of a few topics that I want to cover. Is there anything missing? And so I got some input from that. And then also, if there's one topic you would say I must cover in this book, what is the one topic you think I should cover and why? And so I got a ton of, and so I was already kind of working because I knew I knew anxiety was going to be in there, and I knew certain topics were going to be, so I'd already started working on it, but I wanted to get some feedback as I was still early in the process. And so I got this feedback, and that really helped solidify the TOC, the table of contents. And it made sure, like, okay, yeah, this does, like, for a while. So for instance, there's actually some metadata out there on the internet where it's the wolf in their pockets 12 ways. And the reason is it was 13 at the beginning, and then we reduced it to 12 because we combined, we had a word count problem, like I was way over when I first submitted.
Awesome.
And B, there was some thought maybe we could combine the discernment chapter and the conspiracy theories chapter, which logically makes sense because conspiracy theories are like a subset of discernment. But I was campaigning for them to stay set. I was like, even if I have to dramatically reduce the word count throughout every chapter, I think these merit their own chapters, because conspiracy theories, to a T, 100% of those forum responders all said that conspiracy theories was the thing I must talk about. So that was kind of a shock to me. I mean, I knew that was one that I was like, I know I need to put this in the book. I did not expect everyone to say that was the thing you need to talk about. And so I was like, I really think that needs its own chapter. Like, I think for a lot of folks, they're going to maybe go straight to that chapter. And so I kind of campaigned for it, and one of the editors campaigned for keeping it at 13. So we went from 13 to 12 and then back to 13. So anyway, yeah, that's what a lot of it was, especially in building out the TOC and what topics. And then in terms of writing, it's really helpful for me, and I think it's helpful for the reader, I don't know, to kind of come up with a formula for every chapter. And write every chapter to that formula, at least loosely. So not including like any introductions and stuff. So except for the first chapter, which doesn't, it's funny, the first chapter does not is not in the formula that I use for every other chapter, because I wrote that chapter for the proposal before I came up with the formula that I was going to use throughout the book. But every other chapter, the 12 other topics, it's like intro, stating the problem. Here's what scripture has to say about that. Well, intro, stating the problem. Here's how social media impacts this topic and our understanding of this topic. Here's what scripture has to say about that. And then here's what we practically do. Every chapter follows the same formula. I think that serves readers in some respect, because it gives a rhythm. And if they find like they want to skip certain parts, that it's easy to skip around. It's easy. I think that can be really helpful. And also it's really helpful for me as a writer, because I sit down and I don't have to think, how am I going to write this chapter? It's like I already have the skeleton set up for every chapter. So it takes very minimal thought. It takes a lot of work on the front end to figure out how do I want to structure this. But then it takes very minimal planning and like strategizing as you're writing. Like if I wrote a lot during the week from like 5 to 7 in the morning before I started working. And then similar time on the weekends before my wife and daughter would wake up. And it's like, if I sit down for 2 hours and I need to really crank out content, I need to not be planning what these chapters are going to be like. I need to be writing words down. And so a sort of secret of efficiency was like, just build the skeleton out, and then add the meat and everything else to it as you go. And that way, it can be more efficient that way, and you can kind of go from there.
Yeah, I mean, even for me, it was pretty valuable to have it in that structure. And I think it lends well to like a field manual type book where you're like, hey, maybe I read through it at some point and now I need to recall back to it. Okay, I know exactly how to like go into this chapter, this section, and reference something. So yeah, I think it
certainly doesn't work for every genre. And if you're going to do something that's more creative or artful, like, yeah, you don't want to follow the same formula every time, probably. But for something like this, it's just it really is meant to be a tool or a field guide, as you describe. I want the structure of it to be as uncumbersome as possible. Like I want it to be as simple and straightforward and kind of known. And so I think some readers will pick that up. In fact, I've heard from a couple people already that they kind of picked that up and appreciate it. I think most people may not even recognize it, but yeah.
One of the chapters that stuck out to me was on friendship. I literally took a screenshot. I was reading it on my phone, sent it to a WhatsApp group that I'm part of, and I'm like, this is what I want our friendship to look like, model. And there's kind of been a lot of talk about loneliness and that sort of thing. And some people argue, hey, we should use social media more to connect people. We should kind of leverage increased relational contact. How do you think about, the social media world and how it's impacting friendships?
This is a hard answer for me, a hard question for me, because I feel so split on it. And I kind of figure out, I think, where I've landed. And it's not even, for me, it's not even so much like, here's my opinion, so much as this is how it has to be for me. I don't know. And if other people can approach friendship and social media in other ways, God bless them. But I don't think I could. It's kind of like, I think a lot, this is a sort of personal situation and how you build friendships and how you communicate. In short, how I would summarize it is, I think social media needs to supplement incarnational friendships. And it just, like, friendships is just so vague. It can mean so many things. Like, there are different levels of friendship and acquaintances. And it's like, some people just like call people friends who they only talk to online, and they, it's not somebody they'd call up if they needed something. Is that a friend, or is that just somebody And so, like, there's some language and how you use words that can kind of muddy this conversation. But when I think of a friend, I think of like, hey, if I need to move, I need their help, right? And that doesn't mean you can't have friends who are elsewhere, but it needs to be somebody I have some level of comfort with beyond just like we share interests and happen to follow each other on Twitter. And so there are a lot of people who I would consider like good acquaintances. I can think of them right now, but I don't necessarily consider them friends. Like, we've never connected on a deeper level between some maybe shared interest, or I don't know. I have a very high bar for friendship, maybe. And so I think that's part of it, is like, I think of social media should supplement real life friendship and should be seen as a good way to like make and maintain acquaintances abroad. And so, like, I think of one of my friends, I'll just name him because he won't care. His name's Brandon Smith. He's a professor at Cedarville University, a very brilliant theologian, and writes books on theology himself, did his PhD under Michael Bird in Australia. He and I met on social media a decade ago. And he was living in Texas. I had just moved to Nashville, and we were just kind of Twitter friends. That's what we call, like, that's, what I'm talking about if you hear that. Like, we would tweet at each other, we'd DM each other. We eventually got each other's phone numbers and would text occasionally. We had never hung out. I'm not going to tell him, hey man, my wife and I are having a really hard week. That's just not, we would connect about things we had interest in, but we're not going to have like some heart to heart conversation. I would not have called him a friend at that point. I would have been like, oh yeah, Brandon and I, we've connected online, that kind of thing. Then he was offered a job at Lifeway. He knew I was at Lifeway here in Nashville, and he was like, hey, I'd love to talk to you about what it's like living in Nashville with no family around, because my wife and I are from Indiana. We're here with no family. He was like, we've never lived away from our family. Would love to talk about that. So that was like, we're having a deeper level conversation here. But they came to Nashville for his interview. We met for coffee. His wife and he and his wife, me and my wife. It was like, okay, feels like we're kind of friends now. We're having, and then they moved here and became our best friends. Like we will be lifelong friends because of how close we grew for 4 years here together. Eventually moved basically a mile from each other, went to the same church. We're in the same small group. We became lifelong friends in that period. Right. Now he moved to Ohio, middle of nowhere, to Christian college, 5 hours away, kind of close to where like I grew up, like not super far from where I grew up. And we're still friends, and we keep up on social media, mostly through texting and stuff, but we'll engage with each other on social media. And so I see that as almost like supplementary to my relationship with him. That's just one example. So I think that social media can be useful for friends to maintain connection with each other. And I think it can be useful to connect with people around interests and around like I love video games. And so I love talking with people, strangers on the internet who I only know because of our shared love for a particular video game. And I think that's totally fine. But like, I'm not going to call those people friends, and because I think maybe I have a higher bar than most for how I use that word. And so, yeah, long story short, I think social media can support friendships. I would be nervous about maintaining a friendship solely on social media or having a suite of friends that are only on social media. Because I think what can start to happen, perhaps unintentionally, is you start to neglect sort of incarnational friendships for online friendships. And I think that's where it can get messy really quickly, because it's not the same level of connection. You're never going to be able to convince me that it's the same level of connection. I can't be swayed if somebody, and people have tried. I just can't be swayed that you can make the same level of connection, because I need to know that you're going to come over if tragedy strikes my house. And so, yeah, anyway.
Joel, do not make your argument right now for the metaverse. Hold back.
Oh man.
You like see me like almost jumping out of my seat here.
It's not the same.
It's
Second
not
John, our joy will not be complete unless we see each other face to face. All right, Joel.
Okay, wait. I'm not going to make the argument, but I will say kind of like one of the interesting things I took away is, it's not just like social media, it's a social internet, or, the social construct. And like internet was one of the technologies that fueled this sort of next phase, right? And I'm always thinking of like, okay, like what Chris had mentioned is one of the things that affected that depth of friendship was the presence. And a lot of people who are pushing, the next platform are going to talk about like, well, can we close that presence part of it? And, we won't have to dig into here, but I totally feel that. My brother moved to New York recently, he got married, and now there's distance. And from seeing him all the time to seeing him not much in the past 2 years, it's definitely affected our friendship. And we're using kind of social media and what we have now to stay in touch. But there is a longing to kind of close that gap, right? And, if I had lots of money, sure, and time, I'd be able to fly there all the time. But in lieu of that, I'm going to be looking for some other thing to fill that gap.
Yeah. And I think the point at which, not to get into the metaverse discussion, last year, right? Am I right?
Yeah, exactly.
But like, we've moved on to generative AI. But I think where I would begin to be intrigued truly by a sort of metaverse starting to be competitive, if you will, with like incarnational friendship, is when you get into like mass market haptics, where it doesn't cost $800 to get a good system, and you can actually feel the touch of another human being, because Zuckerberg's crappy avatar is not going to replace hanging out in person. It's just not. Like, but if you can touch each other and like hug each other and shake hands and actually feel that, that's when things start to get a whole lot more blurry for me. But like facsimile cartoon 1995 Pixar avatars is not gonna, like, I'm so far from convinced, because anyway.
I do want to come back on that later, because there is some stuff to talk about.
But when you start incorporating like touch into that, and I think in my lifetime we're going to see that. Like I think this is coming, but I think touch really matters, and I think until you have that dimension, it will fall short, in my view. But I may be wrong.
Yeah, going to another chapter. I mean, there's so many different directions we could go. Thinking about anxiety, you said, of course, I'm going to include anxiety in this book. There's even more and more research that comes out over time. I know you saw Jonathan Haidt's, argument that it's not just correlation, it's causation. Let's not talk about that. I loved your metaphor. You think in pictures of the backstage that you brought out. Can you talk about that? The idea that social media erases the backstage.
Yeah. And I can't take credit for inventing this. I first saw it in Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And I think she's even citing somebody else. I forget who she's citing in that. But the idea of a backstage, generally, it's not that deep, at least as I think of it, is socially, you live life on a stage. And social media, using Derek Thompson's metaphor from Hitmakers, talking about how students today, teenagers, are always in the hallway. So if any of us who were in high school before social media was a huge deal, or before the smartphone was a huge deal. Like the iPhone came out when I was a junior in high school. So even though I was on MySpace in freshman year, I wasn't carrying MySpace around in my pocket. The sort of social stage of the high school hallway or performing socially for my peers was able to be left at school or at in my computer room at my house. I wasn't carrying it around with me all the time and having to feel the need to always be socially performing. And so Derek Thompson makes a good case in Hitmakers that teenage anxiety today is in large part due to the need to always be performing. Like they're always on that model runway of when we were in high school, you're kind of socially performing, walking from class to class, and they simply can never escape that. I mean, it's always there, it's always present. And I think data continues to point that direction. That is related to Backstage. So like if you imagine, and this is, again, take this out of the youth room for a second, like for everybody, all of us are performing socially if we're creating content on social media. That doesn't mean I'm not saying like everybody's like, please pay attention to me, but you are performing socially, like you're communicating something, etc. And so if you are ever present and you feel like you have to be constantly posting and whatever else, there's this draw to always be on stage. And a lot of us, I fear, have not made room to be able to escape to a sort of backstage where we don't have to socially perform and we don't have to show people what we care about and what matters to us. And I think the backstage is sort of eroding for a lot of us. And so if you feel like the need to be constantly online, I think especially about like influencers, if I don't have any plans for another book at this time, for another social media book at this time, but if I did, I mean, I'd love to write a book just like on influencer culture and like all the different ways to look at that diamond and all of the different things that we should think about, not even just from a Christian perspective, but just like generally. Because like I think especially about people who are trying to be an author or trying to be a YouTube content creator or things like that,
or a podcaster.
Yeah, right. Or a podcaster. If you're creating content online, there's this need that you can never do enough, and you always need to be out on stage. And I think a significant sort of reason for our increased anxiety, not only among teenagers but among everyone, is a lot of us feel like the backstage is evaporating, and there are a few places we feel like we can just let our hair down, metaphorically speaking, and be whoever we need to be and want to be in a given moment. And so some people say, well, yes, everybody needs to feel like they feel the need to be polished online or like make everything look perfect. No, I mean, like I think some people are performing, performative outrage, and I think people perform in all kinds of different ways, not just that they have it all together eventually. And even there's been some trends this way on TikTok recently. Like it's now becoming cool to have a messy room and like be messy, and like, okay, now that's cool. It's like cool to not have it all together now. Okay. So it's like everybody's always performing, and I think that's adding to a sort of corporate anxiety we have of like what's real. I think what's at the foundation of a lot of this is we lose a grasp of like what's real, who's being real, and who's just doing something to get attention. And where's that line, and what's real and what's not. I think that's a big reason we kind of feel like we're on sand, if you will, in that regard.
And so enter the church. What is the church to do to provide backstage, presence, so to speak? Like, I mean, some people are like, oh, just ask people to leave their phones off when they come into the church, but like, beyond just setting up some sort of legalistic mechanism, what does it look like for the church to enable more backstage places?
One of the things I was talking with a podcast the other day that like helps churches do social media well. And I think that's important. I am not anti-social media at all, or anti-social internet at all. Like I think it can be used for good. But I think like if I were leading this kind of thing in a church, I would make sure that I would make sure that no one feels out with regard to participating in the body of the local church if they don't have an online presence. So like, with COVID expedited so much of this, but like I've just seen troubling trends of churches putting more and more stuff on social or on the internet generally, that like if people, if there are people in your church who don't have a social media presence or don't love getting on the internet and doing things a lot outside of total necessity, that they may feel left out because you're running that small group on a Facebook group, or you're, like that kind of thing. And so I always encourage churches, because I do a lot of consulting with churches on like content strategy online and that kind of thing, to just always make sure that your whatever content creation and community building you're trying to do through social media or otherwise on the internet feels truly supplemental to what you're doing incarnationally. I mean, it's similar to the friend discussion. Like, don't let anyone feel left out because they don't have a Facebook profile. I'm really passionate about that. I think by all means, churches should use the tools they have at their disposal to try to reach people, but also walk this fine line of like, don't make people feel left out because they don't have a presence there. And that can be hard. And so that's something I would encourage. This is more in I think the chapter on like fellowship and community. But something that I'm really passionate about is churches doing what they can to encourage low stakes social environments. So a lot of churches who are especially more program heavy, like, oh yeah, we have a men's breakfast, we have a women's retreat, we have X, and I think all those things are great. I happily participate in them. But I think like the more that a church can kind of create a culture, and I think my church does this very well, create a culture of community where people just naturally go have board game nights and go out on double dates with each other's spouses, and like creating the more organic community culture rather than feeling like you have to program it into people's lives, I think is huge. Because frankly, I mean, a lot of people are going on social because they want to feel connection. Honestly, this is like, if I have a lot of concerns, obviously, about our relationship with social media, but like one of the things that's most concerning to me is how we going. It goes back to the friend conversation a little bit, but also the anxiety. It's so wrapped up in so many of these topics, almost all of them, that what's so appealing to connecting with other people through social media to us is that we want to feel loved, but we're afraid to feel known. And it's like what Keller talks about in The Meaning of Marriage, where he uses the same language. We're meant to be fully known and truly loved, but a lot of us don't like ourselves, and we don't want people to totally know us. And connecting with people through social media allows us to use people for friendship, and connect with them in such a way that we feel affection and feel like we're loved, without feeling like we need to show who we fully and truly are. And I think I was talking with somebody the other day who works in student ministry, and they said, hey, look, there are people there's teens in my student ministry who are looking for mentors on the internet before they're coming to people in the church, and they're Christians. Yeah. And they're like, how, like, why, how, why are they doing this? And I'm like, I'll tell you exactly why, at least my theory. I don't know for sure. But I said, when they're looking for a mentor on the internet, they can just consume mentorship, like, and advice, and like, they can just absorb it. They don't feel like they're not being observed regularly. This person doesn't know where they go to school necessarily. They don't know. They can selectively let that online mentor in and only expose the parts of themselves that they're comfortable exposing. Whereas if you have a mentor who goes to your church and knows your parents, if you're a teenager, knows your parents, knows that, who your coach is on the soccer team, and knows X, Y, and Z, it feels a lot more invasive. You feel more known and you feel more vulnerable. And I think social media, when it goes sideways in regard to us trying to connect with people, it's not always like this, but when it goes sideways, which is more often than a lot of us like to admit, is we want to connect with people and feel the affection and attachment, but we're afraid of being vulnerable and known. So the sort of the screen, if you will, allows us to guard against being totally known and feeling vulnerable. And so I think, to the degree that local churches can create social environments that makes people slowly over time open up to one another and build deep relationship, that can begin to push back against the constant lure of the appeal of, I can feel affection, I can feel love, and I don't have to expose myself to hurt at all. That is often comes with social media. So, no, well said. I just wish more people would take initiative to show hospitality, have
chess nights, video game nights, whatever it is, like those sorts of just being together and doing that kind of stuff is crucial. I was telling someone, because they were asking me, you know, oh, is it bad to reach out to someone else if I can't offer them something? Like, is it okay to just want to be with someone else so that they can benefit me? Because shouldn't I, as a Christian, always be serving others and pleasing others? And I'm like, dude, like, just message people. Like, Jesus went up to Peter and said, hey, I'm making breakfast for you, you know? And it, like, Jesus did things that weren't like ministry 100% of the time, right?
Yeah.
I just want more of that kind of stuff. And so I really appreciated that chapter. Thinking about this social media and this tension, because I love not forcing your high school students to be on Facebook in order to hear about the events each week. And yet our youth pastor at our church is asking me, and this is, I would call it a larger church by Canadian standards, where like 800, 900 people or something would call themselves part of the church. And so it's a larger youth ministry. And so he's like, should I lean more into posting stuff on socials? He doesn't want to encourage it, but there's something there. And he's feeling this tension. And I'm like, oh, I'm about to read a book, you know, that addresses it, but it's not like you would answer it directly to him and say yes or no. So what are some of the things he should think through to evaluate how to post on social media or not?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is similar to what I said earlier about like, make sure just whatever you're doing on social for students in a student ministry is supplemental, and it doesn't feel like, because you're going to have plenty of kids, probably, maybe not, I don't know, in the student ministry whose parents aren't letting them on social or whatever.
Right.
And so you don't want them to feel left out. And so I would consider that, like, make sure whatever you're doing is not exclusive and doesn't make people feel like they're missing out. That's important. Secondly, so I used to give a lot of advice in this vein, and it's very different than what I give today. I used to just tell like youth ministers to go all out, like create. When I was first giving advice on this stuff, Snapchat was pretty new, and I was like, get a youth ministry like Snapchat and just post stories. Like don't message people, just like post your stories and stuff like that. And like by all means, like jump head first into this. But the world has changed in the 8 years, 10 years that I've been in this space. And I would tell churches and pastors to tread much more carefully today than I probably would have 8 or 10 years ago. Just because we've seen so many horrible circumstances of ministry leaders in general, youth or otherwise, misusing these things in abusive ways, or at least inappropriate ways. And so I would, I was asked a similar question to this by a youth minister a couple months ago, and I said I would make sure that you have a defense for whatever platforms it is you're using, and that you have clear like content plans, and that you only follow those content plans, and that you are able to defend anything at any time from any parent who may express concern. I would never message students individually, whether they message you or you initiate, not because it's wrong, but because it can so easily go wrong. And part of this is being above reproach. Part of it's just wisdom in my mind. Like I had a youth minister ask me, like, there's some guys in my youth group who play video games together. Like, can I set up a youth ministry Discord? And I said, you can. I wouldn't. And not because I think it's wrong. I would love to be able to do that. But if some kid posts something in the youth group Discord that the other kids shouldn't be consuming or whatever, now you have to explain to parents why their kids were exposed to whatever that was in the youth ministry Discord, you know? Because the parents are going to be like, why did you even have this? And you're gonna be like, good question. Unless you have a good reason, in which case, God bless you and go for it. But this is why, like, if some kid says something awful at the Wednesday night Bible study, you know, and or brings something on his phone and shows the kids at your Wednesday night Bible study, and the parent can't say, why were you having Wednesday night Bible study? You're like, well, we're having Wednesday night Bible study. I can't control what this kid brings on his phone. But if you're having a Minecraft Discord server and a mom calls you up and is like, did you know what happened on your Minecraft Discord server? Why are you even doing this? It's a lot harder to justify the existence of your youth group's Minecraft Discord server than it is your youth group's Wednesday night Bible study, where maybe the same event happened at both places. And so I would just express serious caution, because even if the youth pastor does everything right, it can still go sideways. So that's what I would say. But I don't think it's bad, and I think it can be done well. And I think, like, communicate with parents. I think the biggest mistake I've seen youth pastors make over the years is not having regular communication with parents on these matters, and just kind of doing. Often youth pastors are young men who don't always, they're more interested in getting close with the students and hanging out with them than they are with having clear communication with their parents. And so I think, to the degree that you can say, hey, parents, I'm thinking of doing this. Is that okay with you? Does that make you uncomfortable? Like, total transparency on that. Because then if you say, hey, I want to start a youth ministry Facebook group, or, none of your students are going to get in a youth ministry Facebook group. If I want to start a youth ministry Instagram account or whatever, or Discord server, if you got kids who play video games or whatever else, and they're all like, yeah, this, like, I like what you're doing here. I see what you're trying to do. All for it. Just do what you can to keep my kids safe. Okay. Hey, we go about it. We do it. And then if something goes sideways, you can go back to the parents and be like, hey, we really tried to guard against this happening. Here's what happened. Let me tell you everything. That's a lot harder if you just do it and your parents find out this exists later on when something goes bad. So it might be a bit of a ramble, but all of this is to say, you have to, as a youth minister, I think you have to be very careful, guard yourself, recognize that you could do everything right and it could still go wrong, and have constant communication with parents about these things at all times, so that they're not caught by surprise if something does go wrong, that this forum, and I don't mean literal internet forum, but this space, whatever it is you've created online, exists. They should not be surprised that this thing exists. They should be concerned if whatever maybe goes wrong. And I'm not saying it's going to, but you have to be prepared for that.
Yeah. Well, thinking about the different spaces that you create, are you going to go to a carnival with your youth group? Maybe. Are you going to go to the red light district with your youth group? No, like if you are going to avail them to certain spaces where they have access to images and certain things, and even like access to a GIF tool on Discord gives you access to all sorts of images, and parents need to know this. And you need to be wise about what you're actually giving access to anytime you open up that quote unquote space. It's like when parents say, oh, I'll get my kid a phone. It's like, do you realize what you are giving them access to? Like, if you're willing to let your kid roam the streets at 2 a.m. in the biggest city near you at 2 a.m, like, are you willing to give them that level of access to risk? Then sure, give them a phone.
Yeah.
But you got to evaluate it through those types.
Yeah. And the other thing I'll say to the other side, because I've had so many conversations about teens and phones with parents, both in the student ministry where I serve and as I speak to parents all over. There's a cost to both sides of like the phone / social media, because there's the cost of obviously what you just said. You give them a phone, you give them social media, you're putting them, you're dropping them off in your city at 2 a.m. and see how that goes for you. Yeah. And it can go bad. However, like, something that I think a lot of parents who are more protective and recognize that a cost that those parents don't count is that their kid is going to be bullied, and their kid is going to be left out socially for not having a phone or not having access to Snapchat or Discord or whatever platform that their friends are on. That will happen. And so, what I tell parents when they say, when should I let my kid have a phone? Should I let my kid have a phone / social media? Well, there's not a right answer per se. Like, everyone's going to have their own preference here. And I don't think that there's a right answer. Let's say he's 16. We're talking about a 12-year-old. I think there is more of a right answer. But if we're talking like, 16, 17-year-old, whatever, how I frame it is, which set of problems would you rather deal with? Would you rather deal with the kid who's exposed to something he shouldn't be, and then you got to work through that and all of that? And to some degree, some may say I'd rather have them exposed to that while they're under my roof than when they're not. I understand that philosophy. Or that's the price you pay that you likely pay for giving your kid a phone / social media. Or do you want to pay the price of your kid feeling ostracized, being made fun of, being left out of group texts and inside jokes, and not knowing what's going on at the lunch table at school, and come home upset and maybe crying? Your 15-year-old boy is crying because feels like he has no friends because everybody has a phone and they make fun of him because he doesn't know what they're talking about. I've heard that story more times than I can count on one hand. And so that's a cost. And I think as a parent, you have to figure out, do I want to deal with that, or which one do I want to deal with? And I can't fault parents who maybe give their 15-year-old boy a phone because they don't want him. They're like, I'd rather deal with when he comes across something that he shouldn't than him feeling socially ostracized like that, because I was socially ostracized in a lot of ways. So I feel that as a thinking back to my teenage high school brain, I know how hard that can be. And so I don't fault parents who want to do that and who maybe trust their kids, as best as they can, even though they are just teenagers. And so anyway, I just always want to say, I try not to shame people for whichever way they go. I just want them to know that the cost and the risk that they're choosing with whichever decision they make.
Well said. Well, we only have a little bit of time left. I'm kind of curious to talk about podcasts with you for a little bit, because you referenced in a post sometime last year, I couldn't find where you wrote it down, but that you're interested in reflecting on podcasts more in the future. So this is the opportunity, and there's a couple of different questions and ways to approach it. One is, as an author, it just seems wild to me that you have to go through, it's like a book tour. You got to go through on every podcast. Even I felt bad. I was like, okay, don't worry, Chris, I'm going to write a book review. I'm going to promote it. I'm going to try to help you. We're not a big podcast, but at least there's some people listening, and we're going to try to support. There's a weird sort of exchange that happens, and there's just time, and it's free content. We didn't pay you for this, but it's seen as an exchange or promotion. There's that. And then there's also a line of conversation that's related to friendship, and that podcast, to some people, they almost replace friendships because there's banter, there's a lightness to it. They can put it in and feel like they're talking with someone as they commute. And in some ways, it almost feels like podcasts replace friendships. I'm not going to go that far, but there's something there. There's something to, I think I saw something that said, 25 years ago, it was 2.5 hours per day that teenagers were hanging out with each other. Now it's 40 minutes a day. There's just less hanging out time, less friendship time. And so we replace it with online. We talked about that earlier, and podcasts are a culprit. So how do you think about podcasts, the good and the bad?
So first I'll speak to the author bit, and then I'll speak about just my general view of podcasts. So I love going on podcasts as an author. I say yes to every podcast. I will go on a podcast if you can't even prove to me you have listeners. Because I've had a podcast before and know what it's like to have a podcast that very few people listen to. And I am an author that is a nobody and doesn't sell a ton of books, at least historically. Maybe that'll change with this one. So I need all the help I can get. So what happens, and I'm a pretty hard worker. I push myself a lot. So when time comes a year from now and this book's been out for a year, and if sales are where I want them to be or even less, I want to be able to say I left nothing on the table. I did everything in my power to make this succeed. I wrote for every outlet that I could. I went on everything that I possibly could. I want to leave nothing on the table. And I hope that would be true even if I became mega successful. I never, if I'm ever blessed / cursed with the opportunity to be more well-known than I am, I would hope that I'm never a big timer, because I've been with those people and they're not fun people. So as an author, I love going on podcasts because this is way more fun than tweeting, please buy my book or whatever. And so if this is book promotion, I'd rather spend an hour talking about the content of the book. And this has been, frankly, I'm not gassing you up. I don't gas people up. This has been the most robust conversation I've had yet on the book. No offense to the other people I've talked to. But I'd rather go on for an hour and talk about the book than spend 30 seconds writing a tweet. I would rather do that. So I love it. And I am never offended to go on podcasts. And like I said, I'll go on any podcast of any size or radio show or whatever else. General view of podcasts, I used to listen to 5 or 6 podcasts a week from 2013 to 2016. During the 2016 election season, and here in the US, every podcast I listened to immediately became about the election. Basically, like whatever the topics were, they just wove their topics into the election somehow.
Mm.
And I hated it because I hated the 2016 election. So I was just sick of hearing about the election all the time. And so I just kind of stopped, and I got an Audible membership, and I replaced all of my listening time with audiobooks rather than podcasts.
Totally.
I have not subscribed to a podcast since 2016. I will listen to episodes. And more often I actually, like, if they have a YouTube component, I'll pull up the YouTube video while I'm like working on my other screen or whatever. That's more common. And also I don't have a commute anymore. So that's the other thing, is I used to have anywhere from a 30-minute commute each way at one point to like an hour and 15 commute each way. So I used to spend 2.5 hours in the car. And so I had a lot more auditory time. These days, I don't have a lot of time where I would be listening to something. I mean, unless like sometimes while I'm working, certain work doesn't require, a ton of thought. It's kind of rote. But even then, I'm probably have a YouTube video up or a Twitch stream or something like that. So I'm not commuting much anymore. And I love listening to music. So like there's also that. I like listening to music while I'm working. And so I don't listen to podcasts anymore regularly. Like I said, I'll pop into episodes here and there. But I'm not subscribed to any. I don't even know if I have any apps downloaded on my phone, because if I'm listening to them, it's more likely that I'm listening to them on my computer. So, and I actually don't even have my Audible subscription anymore because I don't commute. So I still have like 6 books that I bought with the credits that I had from 2020 when I stopped commuting and don't have much commute time anymore. But yeah, so I went from podcast to audiobooks in 2016 and haven't really gone back, though I occasionally will. I was just listening to one earlier this morning. I'll occasionally pop into an episode here and there, but I think they're great. I love podcasts. I think they're still on the rise. I don't think people are getting sick of them. I mean, maybe they are, but like, I think that they show tremendous potential. I have like 5 podcast ideas that I would love to do, but don't have time to do. And so I would love to do one again. I did one for a couple of years and it was fun. It was just a few of us. It was basically a group text message that we decided to make a Zoom call and let people listen to if they wanted to. And it was a blast, but I had a kid and things got busy and we just kind of had to stop. So, but yeah, anyway, that's my general view.
No, that's cool. I've sometimes said that good podcasts are gateways to good books.
Yeah.
That there is kind of like a hierarchy. Like my wife has never listened to our podcast. Like she loves me, but she will read what I write, but she's into books, not into banter. So anyways, thanks so much for your time. Joel, did you, I didn't leave you time to ask any of your future metaverse questions.
No,
I'm sorry.
We could have a whole other discussion on that sometime if you wanted.
Yeah.
Sometime in the future, that'd be fun.
I am actually quite interested because I know you, Chris, you said you don't have plans for a 3rd book, but I actually really enjoyed this book because of how thorough it was at looking at some of the nuances of social media. And I think, kind of my heart is for like the technologists building the platform, right? Mobile disrupted internet. There is a new platform. Mobile is not the last platform.
Right.
And, like, sure, generative AI is a tech buzz right now, but AI isn't a platform. And I do think there'll be some value in unpacking that later. Like, what is that next platform and how can Christians kind of be more ahead and like anticipate the influences that we'll have? Because like Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, they all have different nuances to them. So this next platform will also but that'll be happy another time.
Yeah, I would love to have that conversation. And I think like I'm not anti-metaverse. I think that what could happen is we could just perpetuate some of the same problems that I've identified. Right. And I want to make sure that however we step into this, we try to take some active measures to not perpetuate those same problems. And obviously new problems can crop up as well. But I think it's inevitable. And I think we need to start mentally preparing for that. We just need to, I want us to have a little bit more caution than we did going into this phase.
Yeah. There's an impetus to have a little bit more foresight, than what happened to us this time.
Yep. Well, thanks, Chris, for joining. Really appreciate your time. So yeah, you can get Chris's book, The Wolf in Their Pockets, wherever books are sold. You can also subscribe to his free newsletter, Terms of Service. Of course, we always link to these things in the description, in the show notes. And so you can do that. Thank you all for listening. Genuinely, I know it might seem like a minor thing to you to listen to a podcast like this, but just a listen, a download is an encouragement to us, as is a rating. Some of you have been doing that and rating our podcast. Thanks for doing that. And thank you to our Patreon supporters as well, who are supporting us financially. If you want to join that group and support Joel and I in creating more content like this, please do so by going to our website, whatwouldjesustech.com. And yeah, we're encouraging everyone to not be centered on themselves. Social media is often centered on ourselves and all about our own profile. We want to be centered on Christ. So we encourage you to do so, to use tech to find rest and to glorify God. Take care, everybody.